So, I want to talk a little bit about speech anxiety because it's something that many people worry about. In fact, a book of lists comes out every year, and the number one fear that constantly comes to the top is guess what? Public speaking. Death is number four. So, if you're at all anxious about public speaking, then you're certainly not alone. So, first, what are we afraid of? Why are we so anxious about public speaking? Well, because we're afraid of failure, right? You're up, you're exposed in front of lots of people, and if something goes wrong, then it could be catastrophic. So, what I want to do is talk about how to reframe some of that anxiety. But before we even do that, why is it that we get anxious and how our body reacts to it? So, there are different kinds of communication apprehension, which is just another fancy word of saying fear of communicating in certain ways. So, when it comes to public speaking, one of the things that happens is anticipatory anxiety, which is the anxiety that you feel before the moment that you have to get up to speak. And that can be really debilitating because you have all these nerves going, the butterflies in your stomach, you're having all these thoughts going through your head, and you're thinking, I'm going to forget everything when I get up there. So, this is all what happens before you actually begin speaking. Now, presentation anxiety is the anxiety that you have while you're speaking. And candidly, I think for most people, once you're actually speaking, that is less anxiety inducing than thinking about it. Sometimes the anticipation of public speaking is much more stressful than the actual public speaking itself. Once you started, you're already in it. So there's a little bit less anxiety there. The other things that can help us have a little bit of apprehension is something called perfectionist thinking. Now, this isn't for everyone, but some people have this idea that this has to go perfectly, and if it doesn't go perfectly, then it's a disaster. And what's the problem with that? Well, then if you make one tiny mistake, you think, it's all over, I might as well not try, and you get inside your own head, and you have a harder time finishing the speech. The other thing that sometimes gets in the way is something called catastrophic thinking, where we assume that everything that can possibly go wrong is going to go wrong. The audience is going to hate us. We're going to be wearing the wrong thing. We're going to say the wrong thing. We're going to forget everything when we get up there. All of these things that we think are going to be the worst case scenario, which actually rarely happen at all. So these are the different kinds of communication apprehensions that can happen to people. The one thing I want you to understand is that all of these things are perfectly natural. One of the things I get asked most often is, can you help me get over my speech anxiety? And the answer is, no, I can't, because you're going to have it naturally. It is performance anxiety. For any of you that ever played sports or have ever done any kind of a musical instrument where you've had a recital, anytime you have to perform in some way, you get anxious. If you didn't get anxious, what that would say to somebody is that you didn't really care so much. So it's perfectly natural. What I want to do in the course of this semester is not necessarily get rid of all that energy, but to channel it and focus it in a way that it helps you get your message across to others. And it is advantageous, so you can channel it into positive energy to enliven your presentation. All that adrenaline that's running through and coursing through your veins because you're nervous can actually make you more engaging, it can make the presentation better, and it can help you in the long run. So, what's the difference between a bear charging you and speaking in front of others? Well, obviously, many things. But from a body perspective, from the way that we react to it, there's very little. We react to it in very similar ways. If you've ever heard of the concept of fight or flight, this is what happens when we are afraid. We get into a panic state and we think, I either have to get the heck out of here or I have to pick up the nearest thing and start fighting back. Now, obviously, you don't want to do that in the middle of a speech because people tend to frown on that, but it manifests itself in a lot of physical ways that sometimes can come across as making us more nervous. So what are some of those? I'm not going to read this whole slide to you, but you know some of them. If you've ever gone up to speak and all of a sudden your mouth gets really dry, or you realize that you're shaking a little bit, or you realize that you're sweating more than normal, These are all physical responses that happen when your body gets into fight or flight, when you get really nervous and anxious before you speak. There are ways to control it, and we're going to talk about them. But before we even talk about how to control it, I want to think about what are ways that we can manage some of this stress as a whole so that it doesn't take over our entire speech. So some situations that cause speech anxiety is this idea that we're conspicuous, right? We're up there and everyone can see this, and that can make us really nervous. Impromptu speaking, anytime somebody just says, hey, get up and speak without giving you any time to prepare. Obviously, if you have a hostile audience, which is an audience that thinks that they don't like you or they don't like your speech, that can make people nervous. An audience of peers or audience of strangers. Some people get more nervous when they're talking in front of people they know, and some people get more nervous when they're talking in front of strangers. Anything that's a significant consequence obviously causes anxiety. If you're going in for an interview, you're going to be nervous if you really want that job. You're going to be less nervous if you have another job lined up and this one doesn't matter as much to you. Most importantly, if you have not prepared, if you have prepared less than appropriate, if you've not prepared enough to feel confident, then you're just going to make yourself more nervous. So what are some strategies for managing stress? So this is where I want you to think about it. Don't worry so much about from a public speaking perspective, but in general, in everyday life, if you're preparing for a test that you have that you're nervous about, or going to a party and you don't really like it because you're an introvert, or you have to have a difficult conversation with someone, what are the strategies that you use to manage stress? So obviously there are lots of different ways to manage stress, right? I will share that for me, sometimes just going to the gym and working out is one of the ways that I manage stress. What I want to talk about are some strategies for managing anxiety when it comes to public speaking that can help you get rid of some of that extra anxiety. So the first thing is to think of public speaking from a communication orientation. And all that really means is to stop thinking about it as a performance and think of it more as a conversation with your audience. When you're having a conversation with your friends or family, you don't panic. You don't think, oh my gosh, how is this word coming out and what are they thinking of me? You're just busy communicating. And the more you can look at public speaking that way, the less anxiety it's going to make you have. And the other thing is cognitive restructuring. This is just a fancy word for saying you want to replace any negative thoughts with positive ones. So if I think, oh my gosh, they're all going to hate me, I might replace it by saying, you know what? These are people who are on my side. These are my peers and they want me to succeed. If I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this speech is going to be a disaster, I might say, I've prepared a lot for the speech and I know it's going to be great. So really taking some of that negativity and turning it into a more positive way. Visualization can be really helpful. This is the idea of before a speech, even sometimes the night before, visualizing yourself from beginning to end, giving that speech effectively. And this has been shown through many studies to really help you in the real situation speak more effectively. By visualizing yourself doing it well, you actually make yourself do it better in real life. And lastly, preparation and practice. The more you're prepared and the more you practice, the better you are going to be at being able to speak eloquently and get your message across. That's really it for speech anxiety and strategies for managing anxiety. If you go to the discussion board, you'll see a space to talk more about what are some of the strategies that you might use to manage anxiety. And I look forward to having a robust discussion with you throughout the week.